Welcome again to another episode of Tech Command Investing, your go to podcast for insights into the cutting edge world of space, defense, and cybersecurity technologies. Hosted by myself, Alain Gavin, a seasoned expert in deep tech investments and disruptive technology. Today, my guest is Ksenia Iliuk, founder and CEO of Let's Data, one of the pioneering startups in the emerging domain of disinformation security. In this episode, we dive into the world of narrative weapons and the unseen war of perception, where influence, infrastructure, and AI converge with critical implications for both civilian life and military strategy. So let's dive in and start with your vision. Xenia, when you started working on fake news and disinformation 6 years ago, few took it seriously as a national security threat. What shifted your view, and maybe theirs, and how did that evolve into founding Let's Data?
First of all, thank you so much for having me today and getting to share the Let's Data story and how we see the problem we're dealing with. So you're very right. When we started with it, it was definitely not a mainstream thing. When I professionally started working in this field, um, it was rather challenging because you were basically on the stage of why. However, I think the big difference of why I started back in the day and why we continue with less data is that we had a bit of a different timeline for that. And the reason for that is that we originally are Ukrainians. We are Ukrainians, we're a Ukrainian team, and unfortunately, Ukraine has been on the front line of information warfare for decades. So that's why when the rest of the world was very much even thinking if they have to ask the question why, we were already asking the question how. So that was very, very different because with the annexation of Crimea and the first invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and then, of course, with the full scale invasion, like all of this was possible due to a very, very expensive and intensive Russian information warfare that was happening for all this time. So that's why when I talk about it, it's very personal. And that's how we started Let's Data, because for us, it was the question of how and not the question of why.
Yeah, and I heard the figure that Russia spends something like 1.5 billion a year on disinformation. It's quite amazing, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. While again, a lot of countries are still on trying to understand what kind of budget they're gonna allocate for it, who's gonna be the owner, and that's always a bit like I think I understand from the political perspective, not everybody, due to different legislation, et cetera, like recognizes information aggression and information interference the same ways that they would recognize other forms of interference. But I think that's kind of like from the way you see the adversaries are treating it. I think there is big inequality on like how we perceive the threat versus how they perceive that and lose the budget and the budget and actually economy of it is something that we could do the deep dive a bit into that, but this is something that has always been a problem, and that's why we actually started Let's Data to change that money problem in this.
Mm, mm, mm. And then let's dive in then from psychological protection for armed forces to early detection of narrative infrastructure. Let's Data operates at the intersection of cyber and cognition. How would you define the mission today, and how do you explain it to a policymaker who still sees this as just content?
Yeah, that's a very good point. That sadly, it's not a content problem, and for years, a lot of different organizations tried to solve it as a content problem. And basically, as soon as this is, and this is what malign actors want us to do. They want us to focus on the content, and they want to very much bring the topic of freedom of speech and like censorship into this debate. What I'm saying and what we at Let's Data try to show is that it's not about the content, it is about the crime. It is about the organized crime behind it. It is about the threat actors, as you said, that invest billions into it. And I always like to give this kind of a comparison. It's like smuggling is illegal, for example, right? And it doesn't matter what you smuggle. You could smuggle teddy bears. Are they bad? Are they harmful? No, they are super cute. Why would anyone object from the teddy bears? Like, we would like to have a teddy bear, but it's not the teddy bears itself. It's the fact that they were brought in an illegal way. So that's a bit the question of how we should treat information operations. And that's how we at Less Data try to treat it as well. Not as a content, not as a communication problem, but as a security and defense problem where we look specifically at coordination and intent. So our mission is to basically, within this concept, to become a standard, industry standard of how companies and governments understand and mitigate information operations.
Mhm. And let's probably go to the next part, which probably the investors listening will be interested in why it matters for them, the investor, because you bootstrapped your company to a $1 million annual recurring revenue and are working across 30 plus countries due to your customers' requests. What does product market fit in disinformation security actually look like? And what's the read on the commercial versus defense buyer? And then maybe in addition to that, what's been the biggest challenge in helping clients recognize, and you mentioned this as well when we met here in London, is that disinformation is not just media issue, but a strategic threat to their country and or organization, because it also hits brands around the world.
I think that's a $1 million question of like, how do we approach this market? Because this is definitely not a new problem. I mean, we've dealt with different formats and variations of information operation, information manipulation for as long as we know humanity. It's probably one of the oldest things that exists on Earth. The question is that that's a very new market. And that kind of brings the question of like, how do we look at this market? Like, how do different players look at this market? How do buyers look at this market from both perspectives? And this is something where I believe this is the market right now that it is in the making, which always brings its opportunities, but also challenges. The opportunities that come with it is definitely, as I mentioned in the beginning, our mission to become the de facto standard. It is because there is no de facto standard as of now.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's kind of a opportunity, an amazing opportunity to be on either at the same time both or one by one on defense sector and national security sector, as well as the commercial side. At the same time, it comes with the challenges, and the challenges that the problem is very, very big. And very often the clients treat this problem in the same way. Even when we come to terms, we've been talking a lot about this, is like, how do we refer to the problem, right? We even like struggle to use the same naming. We have fake news, we have information operations, we have disinformation, we have foreign information manipulation and interference recently introduced by EU. Like, there's so many name of for the threat itself. And I think that's kind of the question. And here I would like to show the first figure, which is the Gartner market mapping with basically for the startups in disinformation security. So Gartner, by the way, is using the term disinformation security, which I like that there is a word security in it. So that's a very good start. Disinformation, on the other side, was heavily politicized, unfortunately, but at least there is this word security in it. So when we look at this figure, there are two figures in here, figure one and figure two. The figure one shows the total investments and mentions different startups here in on the market, and the figure two is showing like kind of key initiatives of the disinformation security startups, which basically brings us to the point of like this different aspects of information operation, and that you should not look for the silver bullet the same way in a classical cyber world, right? We don't have one solution that's going to fix us everything from like SOC to phishing. We have multiple solutions for different angles of the problem, and I think the same is very important for this new emerging market of information operation. So on the figure two, for example, we have Gartner suggests such categories as like content authenticity, narrative intelligence, fraud prevention, fact checking, brand reputation, election integrity, a new one actually, hallucination reduction, and the truth assessment. So we already have like quite a bunch of categories that show us right away that this is not one problem and that we have one magical solution that's gonna solve you everything, that there are different aspects and elements. So as I keep saying, it's something that, and I will proceed to that in a minute to show you how do we see the market, and we see it even much more segmented. And of course, the market's gonna show who's right and who's has the best vision and has the best hypothesis of the product market fit at this stage.
No, I'm exactly to that question, and talking to our listeners, VCs, and strategic funds out there, and LPs listening in. What makes disinformation security a distinct, scalable sector, not just a cyber offshoot? And you maybe go into more detail on that next figure three, which for the audio listeners they can get on the link at the end of the podcast.
So I think what heavily changed in general in this market of information operation, disinformation security is that um, two things I would say change is first of all the access to technology. So the access to technology and ability to create information operations is no longer in the hands of the just three, four bad actors, hostile states that we all know. It's no longer the case. Moreover, we see those hostile actors even outsourcing what they do to the so-called social design agencies. There is a very famous, notorious social design agency in originating from Russia in Moscow, the one that's responsible for the doppelganger, which was an extremely sophisticated, huge information operation, basically impersonating hundreds of media, building the whole infrastructure and like maintaining that infrastructure for months. So we even see like even hostile states are doing that. But in general, with the access to the technology, basically anybody could do an information operation. We have sometimes information operations that target big brands, Fortune 500 brands. And when we track them back, we track them to like a two-man shop in Vietnam. And this is actually a true story. So I think that's kind of like the enablement of technology is the first big change. And the second big change that kind of came with that is like that anybody can now produce any scale of information operation with a very small resources targeting anybody. So that kind of introduces like, because I think there is a part of defense and national security. And I always find myself like in a very weird sport where I have to explain why is the market there, because there for me is like super obvious. But at least in the commercial sector, like we see just this kind of threats again rising in quantity, in quality, in scale, and coming from different angles. So that's why it seems like this is right now becoming a more and more its own market. But at the same time, what's important to say, this is again, it's a hybrid problem. As any hybrid problem, it requires a hybrid solution in a sense that most of the cases, even with our customers, as soon as we identify the information operation, we focus specifically on the early detection. And we've just had like a conversation with one prospect customer the other day. It's a Fortune 500 company that is right now under huge information operation. And we were explaining them that we, as soon as we detect something, we have an ability to send them to you via email because governments prefer the email. And then we have like API integration. You could plug it in your threat intel, fancy stuff. And they look at us and they're like, you know what? We have all this fancy stuff, but we would love an email. And like they told us that from all the vendors they talked to, the fact we deliver it by email is the best because they're like, if it comes in an email, I could just send it to the head of risk. I could just send it to legal right away. And in like 3 minutes, we're all on the same level of situational awareness and we're jumping in the response because that's the question of like the response has to be hybrid at
Mm.
this point. So as you can see on figure 3, this is how we at Let's Data try to map out the market. I think the Gartner did the first iteration, but we believe that the market is much more specialized if we look at it not from the company's offering perspective, but from the customer perspective. That's why what we decided to do is like we took two verticals. The one is diversity and maturity of the threats that organization is facing. And then the other one is the level of operational ownership, which means that how much of the ownership over the product they want to have. Like, do they want like ready to act on insights, or do they want the fully deployed on premises software that they have to fully run and operate? So that's how we kind of structure the market. And you see it also colorized in three categories. The first one is the red one. That's the one we as Let's Data do not want to have a good fit, just because we believe that this is the market that has a lot of great solutions already present. And these are the ones that focusing on either the basic brand monitoring or like more like a fact checking side of the things, which, as I explained, we are not focusing on. The yellow one is like the good maybe. This is where we're looking at the different kind of threat intelligent tools and like mostly focusing on the narrative side of the things. And then the kind of the green, or they are very, very, I called it OSINT dorky tools category. These are the ones that you really have all the power for yourself and your team to investigate any incident to the depths that you want. And then we have a kind of a small category, the green one, which is the specialized info ops intelligence. And that's the kind of a category we want to operate in, both combining the narrative and actor intelligence, whilst again, because we are looking at it as the anomaly. So that approach allows us to detect different aspects of information operations.
And then maybe diving in on maybe another issue regarding artificial intelligence and the Tiberius paradox based on an emperor in Rome that was mentioned in a book that I recently read about from Yuval Harari, Nexus. And he shares a story of the Roman Emperor Tiberius who retreated to Capri for safety, only to have his bodyguard Sejanus manipulate all communication and seize control of the Roman Empire, precise about controlling the information. Eventually, Sejanus was found out. It wasn't easy for the emperor, but he found him out and he was executed. But fast forward to today, and the parallels are striking. Just as Tiberius was isolated due to paranoia on Capri, we now inhabit digital islands where the flow of information shapes perception, and those who control that flow quietly shape our reality. And there was another case he puts in there where an AI, all encompassing AI, a hypothetical scenario of a human dictator that is in danger of losing all control to this hypothetical AI, who says, I detect that your friend, the defense guy who's in charge of all defense, he's about to kill you. And do you want me to liquidate him now? Because if you don't, he will liquidate you tomorrow morning. I've looked at all. I know, but he's my best friend. Why would he do that? Yeah. But no, I've gone through trillions of data points over the last 24 hours and then analyzed it from all different areas. I didn't want to tell you before it was actually real, but I think now it's real. And that means basically that the dictator, if he says yes, kill the the his defense minister, then basically he's become a puppet basically to the AI. Oh, thankfully, we don't have those systems currently in operation today at scale. However, you mentioned one aspect where we've heard of how botnets post 80 times per second on Russia Today and other malign actors are poisoning large language models. How real is this AI risk, and what does poisoning an AI model actually look like in practice? And can you give us some real life use cases that you've seen?
Unfortunately, I can, and that's always with these problems. Like, I wish I would say just a hypothetical scenario, but sadly, we already see the cases of that. I think the poisoning of LLMs and overall the question of how do we approach LLMs from the perspective of what data they're using, why they either they're not hallucinating during the process, right, and to the like what they outputting, etc. So there are multiple aspects of that. I think I would like to focus on two aspects of that. So the first one is still, it's a very basic one, but it's a question of the training data. And this is somewhere where I say that malign actors got a very, very good cash back over the years, because malign actors always had the strategy of quantity versus quality. Always. This bot network that we've detected that produced 80 pieces of content per second. So it's impossible to generate a good quality content. It was pre-Gen AI. Even if they would plug in Gen AI, of course, that would increase their efficiency. But still, like, they were never focused on the quality. Like, we had like multiple information operations that would be so sloppy and so not well managed and have a lot of mistakes in it, and would be like caught just because, for example, very typical use case for Russian information operations is that when they do it in the country's languages and not in Russian language, they would just use Google Translate for that, and they would make tons of mistakes in it. And so it's just this level of quality we are talking about. But they never cared about it because that was not about that. That was about the quantity, creating this feeling of an individual, of their target, like being just surrounded with the information that serve their purpose. And in order to do that, they within these years generated enormous amounts of content um, on their official channels, etc. And that's kind of an easy way to filter them out from the training data, right? And it's easy to say, like, okay, we do not include Russia today because it's sanctioned in the training data. But that comes the second part. They have whole networks of the websites that just rewriting now using Gen AI the same information. For example, the recently discovered Pravda network, which is the literal translation is truth network with a bit pun intended. So it's the one that has almost a dead audience. This is also the same when we discovered like this huge amount of websites, like over 100 of websites in the Balkans that were rewriting Russia today. They had like zero audience. Like you look at the like SEMrush stats, the audience is dead. But what they're doing, and one of the reasons why they so badly wanted to get into Wikipedia through the citation, because they want to fool the crawlers. Because the way the crawlers work, they would go through link and link, collecting all of that information and using it for training, retraining, etc. And I think this is a kind of a new, this is the new use case that we haven't seen before, because we see on the other side, we see respectable organizations, authors are in desire to protect their IP, is wanting, like, working on making sure that their data is not in large language models, right? So we have the situation when the good fact-based information we take out, while malign actors are like offering their, like, sure, we're happy, take whatever you need. Here's like a million articles that we produced. So I think that's kind of like, this is the new type of that, and this is the new type of LLM poisoning. And then if we go about like implementation of these things, right, from the basic scenarios you described, right, to like having this system assist the decision making somewhere, because realistically speaking, still I could talk a lot about, even from that I hear from the industry, about how even the people that are know that they are not allowed to use ChatGPT for their work, they would still do that, and they would put the information there and take the information out, and like all these moments of like, or half of the solutions being just ChatGPT wrappers that are selling right into enterprises that are selling to the governments. So this is the big question of like what kind of decisions they're gonna make, how they're gonna assist, while taking into account that the malign actors got an amazing cashback of producing all of those articles, and now they finally get a second purpose in that.
And maybe going on from there, because I think you recently uncovered campaigns impersonating OpenAI and Sora, and you may want to explain that, trying to lure users into malware traps. What did that reveal about the current blind spots, even in the most advanced, OpenAI companies today?
Yeah, that's a very interesting case that at that moment, like, the OpenAI is not our customer, and the way our product works, and that kind of goes a bit to how we see the market. So I'll do a small detour to kind of show how we see the market, is that we believe that information operation is the anomaly in the information space. That this is something that is not supposed to happen. Somebody creating 50 Facebook accounts at the same time, saying that they are your marketing department, is not supposed to happen. 86, it was specifically 86 posts per second is not a normal behavior. It's not supposed to happen. And that kind of brings us to the other point that we do not care even though we deal with disinformation, but at least data, we do not care whether information is true or not. And this is something that always surprises people. Like, what do you mean? Isn't that all about whether it's true or not? And that goes to the first point we discussed, that sadly, no, it does not really matter. We, right now, around like 5% of all the info ops that we detect are based on the fake information. So that's why we didn't go with the way of fact checking. And in this case with OpenAI, like, the fact checking wouldn't work because basically the logic of this case was that there was an anomaly. And the anomaly was that there was a 36 pages um, out of nowhere within basically 2 hours, in the same manner, put up the advertisement, ads, meta ads. So they put the advertisement on Facebook, targeting countries basically from the US to Japan, like covering almost the whole world. Um, re- Basically recommending users to use Sora. Back then, the Sora was not yet released as a model for video generation, so it was before the Sora launch.
In
So
wow.
they just like recommend to, hey, here's and it's funny because they use ChatGPT to generate those texts. So I always call it like it was AI on AI against AI. So that's a bit of a lot of AI, but that's how apparently the new types of attacks look like these days. So the text of the publication was just like, hey, go to OpenAI, check it out. Great tool for video generation. Look what kind of a video we generated. Super cool tool. So if you look from that perspective, if we fact check the post, there is kind of nothing false in the post itself, in the text, right? Okay. There is no kind of emotional, because a lot of companies also go with this, like, are there any emotional triggers in that? Are there any, like, no, not really, right? So why our system picked it up? Because again, anomaly. The same ads created in the same manner. They had all the same set of links. They were leading to the same set of links. And then they were also done from the pages that had a track record of being involved in information operations long time ago. So that's why our system is like flagging it, like this is an anomaly coming from a malign source, like that has a track record. You have to look into it. And then when our analysts looked into it, because I mentioned like OpenAI was not our customer at that point, so we just like, oh, that looks interesting. Let's see what's happening. So that's when we discovered that actually it was a pretty sophisticated one with all the links that I've mentioned. These were all newly created websites, a bunch of websites that moment, even like we check, because where we go to Total Virus, so just we go to check there right away. And Virus Total basically was like, there's no information yet on these websites because they were just created, so there was no information that they were malicious at that point. But they were clearly like different kind of impersonations of the Sora, like it was like AI Sora, AI, something like that. And then you go through that. It's a perfect copy of ChatGPT. You put in your prompt, and it suggests you to download the file. And the file contained malware. And also, actually, the malware itself, we asked some of our fellow founders from the Google for Startup cybersecurity badge to check it, because we are not a classical cybersecurity company. And they were like, oh, that's actually a pretty interesting malware. Like, it was this kind of a malware that this also a bit AI powered, that it's not that easy to check and detect. So yeah, that was a bit of a long story, but to summarize it, it's an interesting case of like how these things now appear, and it was a complete blind spot for the OpenAI. We
And
contacted
what
them.
did the what yeah, exactly. What happened when you talked to them about it, yeah?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always forget about the good part. So the good part was that because we've detected it basically within the inception. So those ads were just launched, but they were not yet even like running. So we've managed to contact OpenAI to share the threat report with them. They're saying like, "Hi." It was a bit of like out of the blue. We don't know them. We don't work with them. So it was literally like finding some connections on LinkedIn and saying like, "Hi, we're thinking you're under attack. Here's a threat report." I felt myself like, those guys that write like, "We found a malware in your website and just spamming you." I felt a bit like that, and that worked actually. They reacted very quickly. They said that that was a blind spot. They didn't know about that at that moment, and they basically managed to take it down before it caused any damage. So I think that's a great example also of like early detection. Why
Mm,
early
mm,
detection is important? Because going a bit again to the market and how the market is seeing it, there are a lot of great tools for investigation of the disinformation incidents, like super, super advanced dashboards. Like I'm an analyst by the background. Like I would love to just spend my days like playing with those dashboards. So these are amazing tools, but these are the tools that kind of not applicable to this kind of cases, right? When you really need to kill this thing at the inceptions, otherwise you would have to mitigate it. And with every hour that you have to mitigate it, your chances for successful mitigations just are
mm.
going down.
Yeah, so with that useful case, another question maybe around should the security of our AI agents be thought of like nuclear doctrine, yeah, full deterrence, zero leakage, and if so, who sets the rules?
Oh, that is a very, very good question. I think that's because it's a hybrid problem. Again, it requires hybrid solutions. I think going a bit one step back is I would say that multiple governments actually tried to have disinformation laws. Even like they were in most countries they were not adopted, but they were like introduced and discussed. In some actually they got adopted. But what was interesting in that is like there was a few attempts to regulate disinformation as we know it at the basic stage. But because again they were approaching it from the content perspective, um, very quickly the laws were ending up in the position of being called as the censorship laws. And some of the laws in some countries, like even I read through them and I was like, ooh, that's worrying. If I would be a citizen of this country, I would be worried. And they didn't have any bad intention with that. They had like a lot of working groups and etc. They really tried to do their best. But the problem is like they looked at it from a wrong perspective, from the content perspective. So they ended up on this trail of censorship. While I believe that there are a lot of things that, when it comes to the measures to protect ourselves from this, they are about on various different levels. Like if we even talk about the content, the level of content, most countries' constitutions have the basic things about like hate speech, about the incitement to any kind of intergroup conflicts, etc. So the question is always like nobody's ever actually applying those in very rare cases, what we've seen. So even from the content perspective, I would say, and then we have like a lot of the part about the cybercrime and organized crime, but also that can be applicable here. It just very often what is being missed here is the data. They often do not have the data. One of the most typical use case that the governments come to us is right now in European Union with the Digital Service Act. They have additional mandate that they could force some platforms to take the content down, to take some pages down, right? And they just simply do not have proofs, and they don't have an understanding of how collect those evidence, how to identify information operations, how to do the proper attribution of those things. So that's, yeah, I think we already have the AI agent problem, that's for sure. But I think the real problem is that we are kind of not covered in the basics while we are trying to solve the problem that is it's very important, super important moving forward. But on that problem, we still have like very little understanding of use cases and different applications, while still the very basics are realistically not covered.
Mm, mm. Well, moving out of artificial intelligence and into defense and sovereignty section of this podcast, your work with NATO and the Ukrainian armed forces touches real world defense. Can you walk us through a moment when narrative analysis exposed military intention before the kinetic operation started? And kinetic operation obviously means the movement on the ground actually started. So you were able to preempt seeing what was going to happen on the ground.
Again, sadly, yes, in the sense that it shows it's kind of like a good use case from the perspective we all read in books of how kinetic and information domains go hand in hand, and but then what we always see on the operational level is again lack of this data and lack of this threat intel in the real time when you need to make a decision when the situation is already unfolding. We have great use cases that were analyzed looking backwards, but not in the moments when it's happening. So one of these cases for us was like that. It's before, like, we officially started Let's Data basically in June 2022. That's where we went with building a product, decided to move forward. But previously to that, me and the other co-founder of Let's Data, Andrei Kusei, who has a background in machine learning, ex Grammarly. So we were working a lot in the space, experimenting, trying different solutions, testing what's working, what's not. And that actually was the moment when one of the first application that later became one of the core technologies of Let's Data is that when we were analyzing with the start of the full-scale invasion, we were analyzing the information space of Ukraine. Especially at that moment, as Ukrainians, we wanted to be very, very helpful, right? We wanted to make our small contribution in that. So we've decided we're going to focus on that because that's what we know best. Um, and when we decided on focusing on Telegram, because Telegram has been in Ukraine basically for years. It's been like an wild west of Russian information operations, and actually in all of the countries where Telegram is present, it's more and more we see it as a starting point of information operation. Even in the countries where the people are not using it, like, and there's no like high percentage of users. So we often hear from some governments saying like, "Oh, but it's not so popular. We don't need to monitor it." But actually, no, you do exactly for this purposes because it is that starting point that's brewing. So we started with Telegram. We've been analyzing Telegram, and then again, one of the first thing we spot is the anomaly. Like bunch of the channels, over 80 channels were created at the same time with a very similar naming, with even the same profile picture. So
You-
that's the attention. So we were because then back then it was very manual kind of analysis, everything in notebooks and things like that. Even pre AI, so it was good all
Yeah.
this learning stuff. And we started investigating it, and that's when we realized in that moment is that we uncovered the network of Telegram channels that Russia create for occupation. Basically, they created within the first days of the full scale invasion, as they were moving forward, they were creating the Telegram channels for every, not even the city, for every town they were planning to occupy. So it was basically a map on you have a map on the ground. And it was interesting to see that because they were stopped by the Ukrainian armed forces, they even didn't get to utilize some of their channels because they didn't get to occupy all those towns. So the part of them died out even without being used, and the part of them that they had, because they had them basically to Kyiv, including all the Kyiv suburbs, everything. So, and that was basically happening before the actual occupation happened. And as I mentioned, for some, that occupation didn't even happen, but they already had the information infrastructure in place. And how we see them basically using that kind of infrastructure is that that's the first thing that they try to push the residents of those towns in there forcibly to kind of like focus them on the information that only them are feeding to them. So that's a fascinating case from the perspective of like how we actually see when you see this kind of a map of how the kinetic and information space are actually working hand in hand, and not just another theory textbook that says that, oh, it's important.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating case. And moving on maybe to a case where, France is trying to double defense spending and Germany is doing the same. UK has also added a huge amount to its defense spending in the last couple of months. With all this happening, why should countries invest in disinformation security when budgets are tight? Because France has a debt problem, so it seems they're opening they want to open their wallet, but they can't, find the real reason why to, yeah, why they should.
I think first of all, it's like when we even compare it to our personal life, I always like to say is like imagine if the country or a company is a person, right? So when you think about yourself, like the first thing that you invest in is in your security and safety, right? So the first thing you do, you make sure that you have proper health insurance, you have access to medication, that you have a safe, secure home, etc., etc. So even when the money are very tight, you sure, of course, you have to make concessions and you have to save on something. But these are the things that you tend to do. And also from the other perspective, this is also that if we compare it to the human being, sometimes even if we want to save on our health, sadly, it's not in our control. We just get sick or
Right.
we break our
Right.
leg, and then we have to deal with the consequences. So I would say it's a bit of like this disinformation part. I understand for a lot of governments that they don't see it physically. So it's much harder for them to feel the urgency of these things. But if we look again, like just a few years later, a few years prior to the events right now, if they look at the Russian war against Ukraine, if they look at other multiple conflicts happening in the world, the information part is the first part that was there. It was always coming. It's always coming first, and then it's followed by that. Right now, most of the NATO member states are daily attacked by information operations of different calibers by different actors. And again, I mentioned Russia multiple times, but it's sadly not the only threat actors. The list of bad guys is much, much longer, and we see their activity every every time, every day, basically on different platforms. So I think that's the question of. I believe that this is how the governments have to look at it and approach to it. That's not the reality, that I know for sure. So that's why I always say, like, at least what I suggest them in these moments, like, then try to at least learn from other mistakes. And the same in the corporates. The fastest they are buying the solution like ours when their competitor is hit. When you see it happening and unfolding very close to you, that's when you finally understand it, you finally see it, and at least like do not wait till you are hit. Look at your competitor, your neighbor, etc., and then kind of adopt it. Again, always a very ridiculous conversation, in my opinion, because I think they just have to look around. The amount of election interference in every country within the last 10 years just skyrocketed. And I think it just, I always again find myself very in a very weird spot when I have to explain the why and not the how. Of how do we deploy those budgets? How do we procure the solutions? How do we structure the teams inside? How do we build this response mechanisms? But yeah, that's sometimes still the reality.
And do you think that because you showed me a figure around 12-hour window to act, do you think that's a useful figure to bring in here now and talk maybe through that figure?
As you see on figure 4, this is the figure on the, we call it EU deportation camps. So this is about the alleged plan of EU deportation camps in exchange for EU membership. So I cannot specify the country in there because that's the country where we're working with. But this is the story that's pretty universal. Why it's very interesting, because when you look at the graph, you see the graph. It's a time graph that represents of how this information operation unfolded. And you see it started in October 6, 2024. And you see basically that the first inception of it, very, very small spike. We are talking less than 5 publications on the topic by malign actors appeared. There also you see like the sign, the green sign saying the alert. So this is where we send the alert. It was a very sophisticated story because it was first placed in the Times
Mhm.
with the anonymous source, and then it was basically backed up by the Russian controlled media Sputnik. So it was clearly they were prepared for that. They obviously added on top of the information, but long story short, they were saying that for this country, in order to become an EU member, and that country is kind of eyeing the EU membership, they would have to build a deportation camps on their territory, saying that like we want to protect ourselves from all of the migrants, and migrants is one of the favorite topics of malign actors when it comes to the narrative attacks in European Union. So they're like, you have to build it, you have to become this kind of a fort to
Mhm.
protect us from the migrants. And what's fascinating in this story is that you see that the first alert we've sent was the alert that was exactly at the inception stage.
Mhm.
White, and at that point it was green, and that's very important. It is green because the thing with an early detection that we always predict potential damage and velocity. But of course, it can change. So at that moment, it was still a very, very small velocity of the thing. There was a very small number of publication. So it was a green alert, meaning that the thing appeared, it's brewing in there.
Mhm.
Don't maybe have to jump on it right away, but you have to be prepped because it could go up any minute. And then what you see is that there was almost like a 12-hour window before the malign actors actually jumped into it and started their coordination. The
Mhm.
minute they started posting in it in a coordinated manner, the same messaging rewritten in different ways, addressing different audiences. And basically, this is a fascinating case, and you see that it escalated right away in the picture that we have the red alerts coming in,
Mhm.
uh, showcasing that the story is there. And this is a fantastic story from the perspective of proactive approach and early detection. But it's also a very interesting story from the perspective of how important, because for us right now, we do not offer any mitigation. This is something we would like to work on. We have already some plans in our roadmap of how we could work on that, but we do not offer mitigation at this point. So that's why it's very important that we work very closely with our clients. They work closely with the product. They have always the package, for example, like a most expensive package where they could have an expert on demand, etc. And like why it's very important to work closely, because this is sadly the moment when, even though we identified 12 hours in advance, their reaction still was not timely enough, which kind of resulted in the fact that we didn't kill that in the inception. That you even
Yeah.
had this kind of second wave of malign actors coming in. That thing should not have happened. And you know the reason why it happened?
No, why?
You can guess, humans. We're human beings. On that day when this alert arrived, the person responsible for this topic in the team of the government was off.
Oh, really? Okay.
So that's also a reality. So when we are talking about, you ask at the beginning about the challenges in the market and things like that, we still have that. That's we are very honest about these things and transparent that our threat intelligence and our early detection could be as good as the reaction and the actions that are taking by our customers. So that's why we have a very big synergy working with the customers, and we're trying to build a very um, deep relationships that are based on trust, because these are very sensitive topics that we are dealing with, and it's not easy to come to your customer and say that like, hey, we did detect it 12 hours in advance, but you kind of totally messed it up. So
Yeah.
we have to have the certain kind of relationships to make sure that in product it is reflected, that they see the indicators, they see these estimates, they see how they could improve. They have the tools to basically, for example, they have a tool for generating a threat report based on that would say this was a delayed reaction because one, two, three, and yeah, that's
Mhm.
a
And
very
then
important
mitigate,
part.
yeah, if possible, mitigate, yeah?
Yes.
Stop it increasing. Maybe passing on to the next question around defense and sovereignty. Do you think disinformation security should now be treated as a sovereign capability on par with signals intel or space surveillance, which of course the US is big at, yeah?
Yeah, I think this is a question of like from what we see right now, and I think the biggest question of right now it's realistically that this problem is neither treated in one way nor the other, because technically it's not yet working. What I mean with that is that when we look at the classical threat intelligence, like for example, cyber threat intelligence, we have a very clear unified language we all use and talk. We have very clearly defined TTPs. We have a very clearly defined like we use sticks. We There is a very easy way to do the information exchange,
Mm,
which allows
mm,
you to do both, right? You could have the things that you basically treat and keep within the sovereign approach, right? Depending, of course, on the issue, etc. But like you can have the things that you solve and keep fully privately, and you have the capabilities that you have fully privately as the nation state, and then you have a part that you cooperate with and work on with. My personal opinion that it's again, this is the threat that does not see the borders in that sense. So I do believe that this is something that has to be solved as well in this cross-border cooperation hybrid way. So that's why this information sharing is a very important part. But right now, it's realistically not there. It's not working. Depending on what kind of framework they're using, that we are plugging in their framework, and that makes simply like impossible for even within the nation states within one nation state to exchange information. Not to mention to exchange information the same way people exchange information on other threats, right? So that's I think the biggest question. I think the only thing that when it comes to sovereignty that has to be probably handled in this kind of way is the question of offense.
mm.
We haven't touched this topic, but it is a specific submarket in this, and that's also an interesting market because it used to be solely solved by each state. Um, and this is something we also see that the rise of the commercial providers in there and this kind of a synergy between the states, between the private sector and the state agencies. So I think there it's much more about that because it's still the question of unless there are joint operation and stuff. I think those tools for offensive, those tools for reactions, those tools for like creating like the strategies, etc. Those has to be sovereign because I think that's the question of that's not the thing that you share even with your best allies.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And looking ahead 3 years, what does the most advanced nation state disinformation campaign look like? And what gives you confidence we will be able to stop it? Because we saw in the Romanian presidential election case that, yeah, they did something, but they did it way too late. Where do you see this and how would you stop it in future?
Yeah, you were very right to mention Romania in this case because that's a great case of actually again coming to the basics. Is I would be also very transparent in here as much as like as a founder of a company in this space would benefit from fear mongering. I would say and like showing the latest problem and like the latest cases and like how this kind of AI works together and like paint the doomest picture ever. But the reality is like the majority of the information operations are not that sophisticated. And even if they are, the problem is not they are not the problem. The problem of how do we identify those, how do we treat them, what are the benchmarks and in this. So in case of Romania, as you see on figure 5, very simple graph about the Russian aligned candidate that was later disqualified from the electoral race by the Supreme Court of Romania. So all of this, it sounds ridiculous, but even the fact that he got so many votes, it became a huge surprise to Romania. Like it was out of nowhere, just that the candidate itself that nobody knew got so many votes. So here in this case, if you look at the graph, it showcases a very basic thing. It's the evolution of the hashtags that were used by or associated with the campaign of this Russian aligned candidate, Kalin Georgescu. So if you look at this, very, very simple graph once again, you see that the first signals of him using this covert strategy and hijacking the hashtags and heavily trending on TikTok were basically at least 1.5 months before elections, where it was like super clear. Almost 3 months before, it was already clear, but like 1.5 months before the election, it was clear as day of what's happening and what's going on and who is supporting him, what kind of coordination is happening with other channels that have a track record of being a part of information operations. So all these things were there. And the reason is like why it was not seen. The reason is very simple. No one was monitoring TikTok at the government. No one was monitoring TikTok, like, because how most governments would treat TikTok is like, this is the app where the kids are dancing or something like that, which is not that for a very, very long time. But that's how the perception would be. And now after this case, as I mentioned, like everybody wants TikTok. We do TikTok, so in case you want TikTok, please do come to us. We do have this platform covered, but like everybody's now like have TikTok, like we have to have it. But this is for me again answering your question of like how this in 3 years the super sophisticated attack's gonna look like. I would be honest, majority of them would look like this. They would be just a bit faster and a bit more, they would have a bit better unit economics behind that. A lot of the Russia aligned campaigns are spotted just by the simple mistakes of the Google Translate. These are the things that are now more and more disappearing because they are replaced basically by Gen AI, and the Gen AI is much better at these things than the classical Google Translate. So yeah, no fear mongering, no fascinating scenarios of coordination with AI, aliens, or something else, but the very realistic everyday cases that still so many governments and companies are missing because they do not have the proper system in place that are focusing on early detection, that are focusing on like understanding of how that threat intelligence matching with internal capabilities, and basically having a very, very, very simple but response and coordination mechanisms. That's, as I mentioned, like that the person is a one day off and the whole country was basically upside down because of this story. That's uh, something I hope in 2025 should not be a standard.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Final reflections and book recommendations to close. What are the three books? I mean, I mentioned Nexus by Yuval Harari. What are the three books you'd recommend to listeners who want to truly understand the stakes of disinformation age, from propaganda to AI-driven narrative warfare? Yeah.
That's the moment when I ask the team, because we have internally we have a book club. So when we read different books in the industry and just share the insights with the team internally, and that's at the moment when the team said like, this is the moment when you had to promote our book. We don't have a book, and that's the point. They really say that with all of these use cases, we should write a book, but it's a bit of hard thing to combine when you're a startup founder. But I hope this is something we will be able to do, and I will be hopefully able to share all this because we do have a lot of stories like this. The books I would recommend, like I think for me personally, is a kind of a must read. It's called it's Active Measures.
Would
It's active measures is actually the term that was coined by Russian KGB.
would you
That's how they called information operations back in the day. So the whole book title is Active Measures: The Secret History of Disinformation and Political Warfare by Thomas Reed. And I think this is just like a very good classic, basic covering basically from the historical perspective of like how Soviet operations, like from the Soviet operations to the modern Russian operations, how they evolved. And it's also showcased in a very good way of like how these active measures are hybrid. So it covers the part of cyber, narrative warfare, like even like spycraft and connection to the security services. So I think that's a bit of a like definitely a must to start with. And then I think there is a bunch of like books that you could go in different directions. I was focusing on the one that is more a pop books in, so to say, so that like anybody could read it as a start. So the one that is quite famous is "This Is Not a Propaganda" by Peter Pomerantz. In my personal opinion, it's a bit too pop culture book because I work in this field. But I think for everybody who wants to get to know the topic and better understanding, that's also a very good start because it's also covering multiple topics and the topic of election interference in Philippines, which is very interesting as well to look through that. And I think then the final one is also a bit of um, on a side, but it's also a classic. It's just called Cyber War by Richard A. Clarke, and it's mostly focused on cyber, but it shows, even it's like an older book, it shows once again of like that information operation and the cyber goes hand in hand. And I also think that this is something, the part that is missing a bit in the discourse. Like we've mentioned this kinetic information operation synergy, and the same way we have with the cyber, with the very classical cyber attack synergy. So I would say these three books as a good start. If you want to do some more like in-depth reading on some very specific aspects of it, like let me know. Would be happy to share some good papers.
Well, thank you very much, Xenia, for that very insightful look into disinformation and the weaponization of information in our day and age, and how AI is influencing that. So thank you very much again. Yeah.
Thank you for amazing questions.
If you're an LP interested in learning about space tech, defense tech, and security, including cybersecurity investment opportunities, let's chat.